Bankrupt millionaire loses 7.3B company and panics until a poor 6-year-old girl does something that leaves him in tears and changes his life. Before we share this touching account of despair and solitude, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more powerful stories. The crystal champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the 52nd floor boardroom, sending fragments across the polished surface like fallen stars. Richard Hamilton stood frozen, his trembling hand still extended from throwing what had once been a toast to his empire's success. The words from his attorney echoed in his mind like a death sentence. Richard, Apex Industries is gone. $7.3 billion vanished. How? Richard's voice cracked, barely a whisper against the silence of the room that had witnessed his greatest triumphs. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The city sprawled below him, 40 million people going about their lives, unaware that one of Manhattan's most powerful titans had just fallen from grace. Attorney Michael Chen shuffled through the papers with grim efficiency, his usually composed demeanor cracking under the weight of delivering such devastating news. The acquisition contracts you signed last month contained hidden clauses buried deep in subsections. Your business partners, Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford, they've legally transferred all assets to a subsidiary company they control. Everything is technically legal, Richard. You signed away your life's work without knowing it. Richard's legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed into his leather chair, the same chair where he'd made billion-dollar decisions that shaped entire industries, where he'd built an empire from nothing more than determination and his father's dying wish. Now it was just furniture in a room that no longer belonged to him. The irony wasn't lost on him. This chair had cost more than most people made in a year, and now it might be the last expensive thing he'd ever sit in. My father built this company 60 years ago from a single construction contract, Richard whispered, his voice breaking completely. I've spent my entire life expanding it, honoring his memory. How could I have been so blind? The weight of generational failure pressed down on him like a physical force. His father had survived the Great Depression, built something lasting from nothing, and Richard had destroyed it all in one afternoon of misplaced trust. The phone buzzed incessantly on his desk. Reporters who'd somehow already caught wind of the story. Investors demanding explanations. Employees who didn't yet know their jobs had vanished overnight, along with their retirement funds. Richard couldn't face any of them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He had become the very thing his father had warned him about. A man so focused on growth that he'd forgotten to protect what truly mattered. Michael gathered his papers with the efficiency of someone who'd delivered bad news before. Richard, I need you to understand the full scope of this. Your penthouse apartment is mortgaged against company assets. Your cars, your boats, your vacation homes in the Hamptons and Aspen, all tied to Apex Industries. Even your personal accounts are frozen pending the asset transfer. In one afternoon, you've gone from billionaire to... He paused, unable to finish the sentence. Homeless, Richard completed for him, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. Say it, Michael. I'm homeless. As evening shadows crept across the boardroom, painting everything in shades of grey that matched Richard's mood, he realized he had nowhere to go when security came to escort him out. No family to call, his parents were dead, he'd never married. Too consumed with business to build personal relationships. No real friends outside the corporate world, and those had all turned out to be wolves in expensive suits. The security guard's gentle knock on the door came exactly at closing time. Richard stood slowly, his body feeling decades older than his 45 years, and walked toward the elevator that would carry him away from everything he'd ever known. Tomorrow was the anniversary of his father's death, and Richard couldn't help but think that the old man was probably rolling in his grave, watching his son lose everything he'd worked so hard to build. The morning rain felt different when you had nowhere warm to go. Richard pulled his once expensive Armani coat tighter as he walked through Lincoln Park, his Italian leather shoes squelching in puddles that yesterday he would have stepped around without thinking. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him. He donated millions to homeless shelters over the years, appearing at charity galas where the wealthy patted themselves on the back for their generosity, never imagining he'd need those very shelters himself. His stomach growled painfully, a sensation so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. When was the last time he'd felt actual hunger? At corporate lunches in Manhattan's finest restaurants, he'd barely touched his food, too busy discussing mergers and acquisitions worth more money than most countries' GDP. Now, the aroma from a nearby food cart made his mouth water desperately, but his wallet contained only a few crumpled bills, pocket change that wouldn't have bought him a decent cup of coffee in his old world. The park bench was harder than it looked and colder. Richard sat there watching the world go by, joggers in expensive athletic wear, dog walkers with breeds that cost more than cars, nannies pushing strollers that probably cost more than his current net worth. He'd never noticed how many homeless people lived in this park, had never seen them, despite walking through here hundreds of times on his way to important meetings. They'd been invisible to him, just part of the urban landscape he'd trained himself to ignore. "Excuse me, sir," a tiny voice interrupted his thoughts, cutting through the fog of self-pity that had enveloped him. Richard looked down to see a small girl, maybe 6 years old, with tangled brown hair that caught the light in ways that suggested it would be beautiful if properly cared for. Her clothes had seen better days. A faded pink sweater with a small hole near the elbow, jeans that were too big and rolled up at the cuffs, sneakers that had been white once upon a time. Despite her appearance, her eyes sparkled with intelligence far beyond her years, bright green eyes that seemed to see everything. "Are you okay? You look really sad," she said with the directness that only children possess, unfiltered by adult social conventions about not talking to strangers or avoiding uncomfortable topics. Richard tried to compose himself, straightening his shoulders in an automatic response drilled into him by decades of corporate meetings where showing weakness could cost millions. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Shouldn't you be in school?" He glanced around, looking for parents or guardians who might be wondering where this child had wandered off to. The girl tilted her head, studying him with unsettling perception that made Richard feel like he was being analyzed by someone much older and wiser than her apparent age. "Today's Saturday, mister, and you're not fine. I can tell because you keep touching your stomach like my mum used to when we didn't have food money, and your eyes are red like you've been crying." She reached into a crumpled paper bag and pulled out half a sandwich wrapped in a napkin. "Here, peanut butter and jelly. It's not fancy, but it helps when your stomach hurts from being empty." Richard stared at the offering, his throat tightening with emotion he couldn't control. This child, who clearly had so little, was trying to feed him. The sandwich looked homemade but simple, the kind of basic meal that represented survival rather than choice. I can't take your food. You need it more than I do." "My name's Emma," she said, completely ignoring his protest and pressing the sandwich into his hands with the firmness of someone used to making executive decisions despite her age. "What's yours?" "Richard," he managed, his voice hoarse with emotion that threatened to overwhelm him entirely. Emma nodded seriously, as if filing away this information for future reference. "Nice to meet you, Richard. My grandmother always said sharing food makes it taste better and makes the person sharing it feel better too. She was really smart about stuff like that." She paused, studying his expensive but now wrinkled clothes with the analytical eye of someone who'd learned to read situations quickly. "You weren't always poor, were you?" The question hit him like a physical blow, not because it was rude, but because it was so perceptive. This 6-year-old had seen through his facade in seconds, reading the truth in details he hadn't even noticed himself. "How did you know that?" Emma smiled, revealing a gap where her front tooth should be, making her look even younger and more vulnerable. "Your hands are too soft for being poor very long. They don't have the rough spots that come from doing hard work or washing clothes in sinks. And your coat is really good quality, even though it's dirty now." The stitching is different from cheap clothes. My grandmother taught me to notice things like that. Plus, you stand up straight like my teacher says rich people do on TV. Even when you're sad." She shrugged as if her observation was perfectly normal, as if everyone could read people like open books. "What happened to your money?" Richard found himself sitting on the park bench with Emma, sharing not just her sandwich but his story. There was something about this child's direct, non-judgmental questions that made him want to answer honestly, to unburden himself to someone who had no agenda, no corporate connections, no reason to use his information against him. She listened with the intensity of someone much older, occasionally nodding or asking surprisingly insightful questions that cut straight to the heart of complex business matters. "So these men who were your friends," Emma said, swinging her legs from the bench in the carefree way that only children can manage. "They tricked you into signing papers that gave them your whole company? Like all of it?" "That's actually a very accurate summary," Richard admitted, amazed at how she distilled his complex legal nightmare into such simple terms. 3 Harvard-educated lawyers had spent hours explaining the intricacies of corporate law and asset transfer. But Emma had grasped the essential betrayal in minutes. Emma frowned, her small face scrunching in concentration that made her look like a tiny professor working through a difficult theorem. "That sounds like the fox and the crow story Grandma used to tell me. The fox tricks the crow into dropping his cheese by making him sing, telling him how beautiful his voice is. The crow gets so happy about the compliments that he opens his mouth and loses his food." She looked up at Richard with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "Did they make you feel special before you signed the papers?" Richard's breath caught in his throat. The memory came flooding back. Stevens clapping him on the back at the country club. Martinez praising his vision at the quarterly board meeting. Crawford calling him a genius at the charity gala just weeks before the signing. They praised my leadership, said I was the only one who could lead the expansion they were proposing. They made me feel like I was finally getting the recognition I deserved after years of building the company. He stared at Emma in amazement. "How do you see these things so clearly?" "Grandma said I see patterns where other people just see pieces," Emma replied matter-of-factly, as if discussing something as mundane as the weather. "She said my brain works different, like a puzzle that puts itself together even when some pieces are missing. She took me to a doctor once who used big words like exceptional cognitive processing and pattern recognition capabilities, but Grandma just said I was special, and that was enough." She pulled a worn notebook from her pocket, its pages filled with childish handwriting and surprisingly sophisticated drawings. "I draw the patterns sometimes when I see them in my head. Want to see?" Richard watched in growing amazement as Emma flipped through pages filled with incredibly detailed drawings and numbers. There were mathematical sequences he recognized from his MIT engineering degree, but arranged in ways he'd never seen before. Market trend graphs that looked remarkably similar to stock patterns he'd studied. Organizational charts that resembled the corporate structures he'd learned about at Harvard Business School. Flowcharts showing cause and effect relationships that would have impressed his strategy consultants. "Emma," Richard said slowly, his voice filled with wonder and growing excitement, "where did you learn to draw like this? These concepts are graduate-level business and mathematics." "I just see them in my head," she said simply, as if everyone could visualize complex systems and relationships. "Like when I look at your problem, I can see the shape of it. The papers you signed, they probably had lots of big words to hide the important parts. Right? That's a pattern too. People hide important things in boring places because they know others won't look carefully there." Richard felt his heart racing as the implications of what he was seeing began to dawn on him. "Emma, what happened to your parents? Where do you live?" The question came out more urgently than he'd intended, but he had to know more about this extraordinary child. Emma's expression grew sad, shadows crossing her young face like clouds blocking the sun. "Grandma died 6 months ago. She was taking care of me because my parents died in a car accident when I was little. I don't really remember them much. Grandma said they were smart people too, that I got my brain from them. She brightened slightly, the resilience of childhood reasserting itself. But I'm okay. I'm good at figuring things out, and there are nice people like Ms. Rodriguez at the library who help me sometimes. The implications hit Richard like a thunderbolt. This brilliant child was essentially homeless, surviving on her extraordinary mind and the kindness of strangers, navigating a world that probably had no idea how to handle someone with her capabilities. At the same time, he was sitting here with problems that seemed insurmountable to him, while she was already seeing solutions he couldn't even imagine. "Emma," Richard said carefully, his mind racing with possibilities he couldn't fully articulate yet, "would you like to help me with something? It might be complicated, but I think you might see things that I'm missing. Things that could be very important." Emma's eyes lit up with excitement, her whole face transforming with the joy of someone being offered a challenge worthy of her abilities. "Really? Like a puzzle?" "A big one. Exactly like a puzzle. A very big, very important puzzle that could change both of our lives." Richard pulled out his phone, which still worked despite everything else falling apart around him. His former partners hadn't thought to cut off his cellular service yet, probably assuming he was too devastated to fight back. "I have copies of all the contracts I signed. Digital files that my lawyer sent me before everything happened. Would you be willing to look at them? Can we go somewhere warm?" Emma asked practically, her child's mind cutting straight to the immediate problem. "My fingers work better when they're not cold. And these kinds of puzzles need good thinking." Richard looked around the park, suddenly realizing he had no idea where they could go. His credit cards were frozen, his office was locked and probably being cleaned out by his former partners, his apartment sealed by the bank. Every place he'd once considered his was now forbidden territory. I don't actually know where we can go." Emma stood up, brushing crumbs from her worn jeans, with the practical efficiency of someone used to making do with what was available. "I know a place. The library is warm, and they have computers that work really well. Ms. Rodriguez, who works there, is nice to me. She lets me use the internet for learning and never asks too many questions about where my parents are." She looked up at Richard with concern that seemed too mature for someone her age. "You really don't have anywhere to go, do you?" The reversal of their situation struck Richard powerfully. This homeless 6-year-old was now offering him shelter and resources, taking charge of their situation with the confidence of someone who'd learned early that survival meant being resourceful. "No," he admitted quietly, the word carrying the weight of his complete fall from grace. "I don't." Emma reached up and took his hand with the confidence of someone used to taking charge of difficult situations, her small fingers surprisingly strong and warm. "It's okay. We'll figure it out together. That's what Grandma always said. Problems get smaller when you share them with the right person, and they disappear completely when you share them with someone who sees things differently than you do." As they walked toward the library, Richard found himself studying Emma more closely. Her observations about people and patterns weren't just clever party tricks. They demonstrated a level of analytical thinking that most adults never developed. Even with years of expensive education, the way she'd immediately understood the core of his business problem, reduced it to its essential elements, and begun thinking about solutions was remarkable. But more than that, there was something in her approach that reminded him of his father, a practical intelligence that cut through complexity to find simple truths. "Emma," he said as they reached the library steps, the imposing stone building looking like a sanctuary in his current circumstances. "Have you ever been tested? For your intelligence, I mean. Officially." Emma shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying both indifference and disappointment. "Grandma said schools wouldn't know what to do with me anyway. She tried to get me into some special programs, but they wanted too much paperwork and asked too many questions about insurance and permanent addresses. She taught me at home mostly, reading, writing, numbers, history." She paused, looking up at the library with obvious affection. "But I learned other stuff too, just by watching and listening, like how people's voices change when they're lying, or how numbers in business papers usually tell a different story than the words do. Richard stopped walking, staring at her with growing excitement and disbelief. What do you mean about numbers telling different stories? Well, Emma said, settling onto the library steps as if preparing to give a lecture, her young voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something obvious. When grown-ups want to hide something in business papers, they put the scary numbers in tiny print in weird places, but they have to put them somewhere because of rules, right? So if you ignore all the big words and just follow the numbers like a treasure map, you can usually see what's really happening. Richard felt his pulse quickening with the first real hope he'd felt since yesterday's disaster. Have you ever done that? Followed the numbers in business papers? Emma nodded enthusiastically, her entire demeanor brightening with the joy of sharing something she was passionate about. Sometimes I find newspapers in the trash, and they have business sections with lots of numbers and company reports. I like looking at the patterns in the stock numbers and company reports. They're like stories, but told with math instead of words. The math never lies, even when the words try to. Inside the library's warmth, Emma led Richard to a quiet corner with public computers, moving through the space with the familiarity of someone who'd spent countless hours here. The building felt like a sanctuary, high ceilings, warm lighting, the comforting smell of books and knowledge. Ms. Rodriguez, a kind-faced librarian in her 50s with graying hair and gentle eyes, waved at Emma with obvious affection. "Hello, sweetie. I was wondering when you'd come by today," Ms. Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine care. Then she noticed Richard, her expression shifting to polite curiosity mixed with protective concern. "And who's your friend?" "This is Richard," Emma said simply, with the straightforward honesty that characterized all her interactions. "He's helping me with a big puzzle about business papers. It's really complicated." Ms. Rodriguez smiled warmly at Richard, though her eyes held the subtle questions of someone who'd learned to be cautious about adults who befriended children without obvious connections. "Any friend of Emma's is welcome here. She's one of our most dedicated researchers, aren't you, honey? She reads everything, business journals, science magazines, history books. I've never seen a child with such curiosity about the world." As Emma logged into the computer with practiced ease, her small fingers flying over the keyboard with surprising speed and confidence, Richard marveled at how this child had created a support network for herself. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving, using every resource available to continue learning and growing, despite circumstances that would have broken many adults. "Okay, Richard," Emma said, patting the chair beside her with the authority of someone taking charge of an important project. "Show me these contract papers. I want to see what tricks they use to steal your company." Richard opened his email and pulled up the files his attorney had sent him. The contracts filled the screen, dozens of pages of dense legal language, corporate structures, financial terms, and subsections that would have challenged even experienced business lawyers. Emma leaned forward, her small fingers tracing patterns on the screen as she began to read, her eyes moving in complex patterns that suggested she was processing information at a speed that seemed impossible. What happened next defied everything Richard thought he knew about human capability. Emma began reading at a speed that seemed impossible for anyone, let alone a 6-year-old, her eyes darting across the screen in complex patterns. She wasn't just reading words, she was processing, analyzing, cross-referencing information in real time, her mind working like a computer designed specifically for pattern recognition and analysis. "This is weird," Emma said after less than 10 minutes, her young voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd spotted something important. "These papers are lying, not just a little bit, they're lying in a really sneaky way." "What do you mean?" Richard leaned closer, his heart beginning to race with anticipation. Emma pointed to a section buried deep in the contract, her finger moving with the precision of someone who'd found exactly what she was looking for. "See these numbers here? They say the new company, Hamilton Stevens Holdings, owns 51% of your old company, Apex Industries. That makes it sound like you still have some control, right? But look at this part over here. She scrolled to a different section with the confidence of someone who'd already mapped out the entire document in her mind. This says your friend's company, Stevens, Martinez and Crawford LLC, owns 100% of Hamilton Stevens Holdings. And then this part says Hamilton Stevens Holdings owns everything you used to own. Richard squinted at the screen, following Emma's logic as she traced the complex web of corporate ownership. The legal language that had seemed straightforward when his lawyers explained it was revealing itself to be something much more sinister. I think I see what you're saying, but the lawyers said this was a standard partnership structure. It's like a shell game, Emma interrupted, her excitement growing as the pattern became clearer to her. You know, where someone hides a ball under cups and moves them around really fast so you can't tell where it went. They made it look like you were joining with them as equal partners, but really, they were taking everything and hiding it under different names so you couldn't see what was happening. Emma's fingers flew across the keyboard, opening multiple documents simultaneously with the multitasking ability of someone whose mind operated on multiple levels at once. Look, Richard, every single contract you signed has the same pattern. They made you think you were expanding your business into new areas, but each paper actually moved a piece of your company into their control. The construction division went to Hamilton Stevens Construction. The real estate holdings went to Hamilton Stevens Properties. Even your father's original patents went to Hamilton Stevens Technologies. Richard felt his chest tightening as the full scope of his betrayal became clear. These weren't just business partners who'd gotten greedy. They were professional thieves who'd planned this systematically, probably for months. They planned this for a long time, didn't they? Maybe even years, Emma said, her young face serious with the weight of what she was discovering. But here's the thing, Richard. They made a mistake, a really big one. She opened another document, her eyes scanning it with the intensity of someone who'd found a crucial piece of evidence. Look at the dates on these signatures. Emma's small finger traced across the screen, highlighting dates that Richard had never paid attention to before, details that had been buried in the avalanche of paperwork during the signing process. See this contract for the construction division transfer. You signed it on March 15th at 2:47 p.m. I can see the timestamp in the digital signature data, but look at the date stamp when it was filed with the Secretary of State's office, March 12th at 9:23 a.m. Richard leaned closer, his heart beginning to race as the implications became clear. That's 3 days before I signed it. How is that possible? Exactly. Emma's eyes sparkled with the thrill of discovery, her excitement infectious despite the serious nature of what she was uncovering. And this one for the real estate holdings, and this one for the technology patents too. They filed all these papers with the government before you signed them. That means they were so sure you'd sign. They submitted the paperwork early. But that's fraud, isn't it? You can't transfer ownership of something based on signatures that don't exist yet. Richard's mind reeled as the full scope of the deception became clear. Emma, if those dates are accurate, it means the contracts were fraudulent from the beginning. They couldn't legally transfer assets based on signatures that didn't exist yet. He stared at this remarkable child who had just handed him the key to potentially reclaiming his life. How did you see that? I've had 3 of the best corporate lawyers in Manhattan review these documents for weeks. Emma shrugged with the casual confidence of someone used to seeing what others missed, her matter-of-fact tone making her revelation even more powerful. Grown-ups usually look at the big, important-looking parts, the money amounts, the company names, the fancy legal words. Kids look at everything because we don't know what's supposed to be important yet. Plus, I always check dates on everything because Grandma taught me that timing tells you more about people's real intentions than their words do. She scrolled through more documents, her small hands moving with the precision of someone who'd found a clear trail to follow. Plus, there's something else weird that they probably didn't think anyone would find. Emma opened a new document, one Richard had never seen before, buried deep in the digital files. This was attached to one of your contracts, but it was hidden in the computer code metadata. I found it by accident when I was looking at the file properties. Where did you learn to look at file metadata? Richard asked, amazed at the technical sophistication this child was displaying. YouTube University, Emma said with a grin, using a phrase that made her sound much older than her years. There are tutorials for everything if you know how to look. Grandma said learning was the most important thing I could do, so I try to learn something new every day. Computer stuff is really interesting because it's all patterns and logic. The document Emma had found was an email chain between Stevens, Martinez and Crawford, discussing their plans in detail. Richard read with growing anger and amazement as he saw his supposed friends referring to him as the Mark and discussing how they would eliminate the Hamilton problem permanently once the transfers are complete. These men really aren't your friends. Are they? Emma asked softly, reading the emotions on Richard's face with the perceptiveness that characterized everything she did. Richard felt tears welling up in his eyes, not from sadness this time, but from overwhelming gratitude and amazement at what this extraordinary child had accomplished in less than an hour. Emma, you've just saved my company. You've uncovered fraud that 3 law firms missed. You've given me evidence that could send these men to prison and restore everything my father built. But even as he said it, Richard realized that what Emma had given him was much more than legal ammunition. She had shown him something invaluable about looking at problems differently, about the power of seeing patterns that others missed, about the wisdom that could come from the most unexpected sources. Emma smiled, her gap-toothed grin lighting up her entire face with the joy of someone who'd been given the chance to use her gifts for something important. That's what friends do, right? They help each other solve puzzles. She paused, then added with startling wisdom that seemed to come from someone much older. Besides, I think we both needed saving, Richard. You needed someone to see the truth that was hiding in plain sight, and I needed someone to believe that I could help with grown-up problems. Richard realized she was absolutely right. In trying to help each other, they had both found exactly what they needed most. But more than that, Emma had given him something he'd lost somewhere along the way in his climb to success, the ability to see clearly, to trust his instincts, and to recognize that sometimes the most powerful solutions come from the most unlikely sources. Emma, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion and determination, would you like to help me get my company back? Really help me. This is going to be complicated and probably dangerous, but with your mind and my knowledge of how business works, I think we might be able to do something amazing. Emma's eyes widened with excitement, and something that might have been the first real hope she'd felt since her grandmother died. You mean it? You really want my help with something this important? I've never been more serious about anything in my life, Richard replied, and he meant every word. The next morning, Richard and Emma sat in a small diner near the library, sharing a breakfast that cost less than Richard used to spend on coffee, but the modest meal felt like a feast because it came with hope, something Richard hadn't tasted in days. Emma had spent the night at a youth shelter, while Richard had found refuge in a 24-hour laundromat, but they'd agreed to meet early to plan their counterattack. We need a lawyer, Richard said, stirring his coffee absently. Someone who specializes in corporate fraud. Someone with the resources to take on Stevens, Martinez and Crawford. But every good attorney in the city either works for them or owes them favors. Emma looked up from her pancakes, syrup on her chin and determination in her eyes. What about someone who doesn't owe them anything? Someone they wouldn't think to buy off? Like who? Most lawyers capable of handling a case this big are already connected to the corporate world somehow. Emma pulled out her worn notebook, flipping to a page covered with her distinctive drawings and notes. I've been thinking about patterns again. Your friends stole your company by hiding things in plain sight, right? So maybe we need to fight them the same way, By finding help in places they wouldn't think to look. Richard leaned forward, intrigued. What do you mean? Well, Emma said, her young voice taking on the analytical tone that had become familiar. When I was researching corporate fraud cases on the library computers yesterday, I found this story about a lawyer named Sarah Chen. She's only been practicing for 5 years, but she's won 3 major cases against big corporations. The article said she grew up poor and became a lawyer specifically to help people who get cheated by rich companies. Richard felt a spark of interest. Chen? Any relation to my attorney Michael Chen? Emma's eyes widened. That would be a really interesting coincidence, wouldn't it? Maybe she knows how the system works from the inside. She flipped to another page in her notebook. According to the internet, she works for a small firm that takes cases other lawyers won't touch. And here's the best part. She's never lost a case involving fraudulent contracts. Emma, that's brilliant. Even if my former partners know about her, they'd never consider her a real threat because she doesn't have the resources of a major firm. Richard felt his pulse quickening with the first real strategic thinking he'd done since losing everything. But how do we afford her? I have maybe $50 left. Emma smiled with the confidence of someone who'd already worked out this problem. That's the beauty of it. According to her firm's website, they work on contingency for fraud cases. That means they only get paid if we win. And with the evidence I found in those contracts, we've got a really strong case. Richard stared at this remarkable child, amazed once again by her ability to see solutions where he saw only obstacles. You researched all of this last night? I couldn't sleep, Emma admitted. My brain gets too excited when it's working on a big puzzle. So I went back to the library after the shelter lights out and used the computers. Ms. Rodriguez gave me special permission because she knows I'm careful. The idea of this 6-year-old spending her night researching legal strategies while he wallowed in self-pity made Richard feel both humbled and inspired. Emma, you're absolutely right. Sarah Chen could be exactly what we need, but there's something else we have to consider. Once we start this fight, Stevens and his partners are going to realize what we've found. They might come after us. Emma's expression grew serious, but not frightened. Grandma always said that standing up to bullies is scary, but letting them win is worse. Besides, she added with a slight grin, they probably think you're too broken to fight back, and they definitely don't know about me. That gives us an advantage. Richard found himself smiling for the first time since his world collapsed. This child's courage and strategic thinking were remarkable, but more than that, she was giving him something he'd lost, the belief that fighting back was possible. All right, Richard said, pulling out his phone. Let's call Sarah Chen and see if she's willing to take on 3 of Manhattan's most powerful corporate attorneys. Emma clapped her hands together with excitement. This is going to be so interesting. I've never seen a real legal battle before. As Richard dialed the number, he realized that Emma was about to see much more than a legal battle. She was about to help orchestrate one of the most important corporate fraud cases in recent history. And somehow, that seemed perfectly natural for a 6-year-old genius who saw patterns where others saw only chaos. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. Chen and Associates? This is Sarah Chen speaking. Ms. Chen, Richard began, his voice steadying with newfound determination. My name is Richard Hamilton, and I believe I have evidence of corporate fraud that you might find very interesting. There was a pause. Then, Richard Hamilton of Apex Industries, I heard about what happened. I'm listening. Sarah Chen's office occupied the 3rd floor of a converted brownstone in Brooklyn, a far cry from the gleaming Manhattan towers where Richard had conducted business for decades. But the moment he and Emma walked in, Richard knew they'd found the right person. The walls were covered with framed articles about her victories against corporate giants, and her desk was organized with the precision of someone who left nothing to chance. Sarah herself was younger than Richard had expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the confident demeanor of someone who'd learned to punch above her weight class. She greeted them with professional warmth, though Richard caught her surprised glance at Emma. "Mr. Hamilton, I have to admit, I'm curious about what you've discovered. When I heard about Apex Industries' situation, the whole thing seemed unusually clean for such a large transfer of assets." She gestured for them to sit in chairs across from her desk. "And this must be your daughter?" "Actually," Emma said before Richard could answer, "I'm his partner. I'm the one who found the evidence." Sarah's eyebrows rose, but she didn't miss a beat. "I see. Well, partner, why don't you show me what you've discovered?" For the next hour, Emma walked Sarah through the fraudulent contracts with the same methodical precision she'd shown Richard. Sarah's expression grew more intense with each revelation, and Richard could see the attorney's mind working, already formulating legal strategies. "This is extraordinary," Sarah said finally, leaning back in her chair. "The predated filings alone constitute multiple felonies. Add in the hidden email communications about eliminating the Hamilton problem, and we're looking at conspiracy charges as well." She looked directly at Emma. "How old are you, honey?" "6, Emma replied simply. "But Grandma always said age doesn't matter when you're looking for truth." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of having a 6-year-old as a key witness in a major fraud case. "Emma, what you found here could not only restore Mr. Hamilton's company, but also send some very powerful people to prison. Are you prepared for what that might mean?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "You mean they might try to hurt us, or make us look bad?" "Possibly. These men have billions of dollars at stake and reputations to protect. They'll use every resource available to discredit this evidence and anyone associated with it." Richard felt protective instincts surge through him. "Sarah, Emma's just a child. If there's any danger, I can handle myself," Emma interrupted firmly. "Besides, they already took everything from you, Richard. What more can they do? And I don't have anything for them to take away except my brain." "And they can't steal that." Sarah smiled at Emma's logic. "You're right, but there are other ways to attack someone's credibility. They might try to claim that a child couldn't possibly understand such complex documents, or that an adult coached you to say certain things." Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out a small digital recorder. "That's why I recorded myself explaining everything I found, with timestamps and everything. I also made copies of all my research notes in my own handwriting. Grandma taught me to always keep records when something was important." Sarah stared at the recorder, then at Emma, then back at the recorder. "You recorded yourself analyzing the evidence?" "3 times, actually. Once when I first found the problems, once when I explained it to Richard, and once last night when I went through everything again to make sure I hadn't missed anything." Emma set the recorder on Sarah's desk. "Grandma said the best way to prove you understand something is to explain it clearly to someone else." Richard watched Sarah's expression shift from surprise to admiration to something approaching awe. "Emma, in 30 years of legal practice, I've never seen evidence this well documented by anyone, let alone a 6-year-old. I want to make sure we win," Emma said simply. "Richard's father built something important, and these men stole it. That's not fair, and it's not right." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, reviewing Emma's notes and listening to portions of her recorded analysis. Finally, she looked up with the expression of someone who just realized they were holding a winning lottery ticket. "I'll take the case," she said, "but I want to be clear about something. This isn't going to be easy or quick. Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford have unlimited resources and some of the best lawyers money can buy. They'll fight dirty, and they'll try to destroy anyone who threatens them." Richard nodded gravely. "I understand the risks." "Do you?" Sarah asked pointedly. "Because once we file these fraud charges, there's no going back. They'll come after both of you with everything they have." Emma stood up from her chair, her small frame somehow commanding attention in the serious adult conversation. "Ms. Chen, sometimes the right thing to do is scary, but that doesn't mean you don't do it." She looked directly into Sarah's eyes. "My grandma used to say that bullies count on good people being too afraid to fight back. Are we going to prove her right, or are we going to show them that stealing is wrong, no matter how much money you have? Sarah smiled, and Richard could see the moment when the attorney realized she wasn't just taking on a case. She was joining a crusade led by the most unlikely general imaginable. "All right then," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. "Let's go to war." The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan had never felt more intimidating to Richard than it did that Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. Sarah had worked with unprecedented speed to file their fraud charges, but now came the hard part, proving their case in front of a judge who would determine whether Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford would face criminal charges and whether Richard could reclaim his company. Emma sat between Richard and Sarah at the plaintiff's table, wearing a simple blue dress that Sarah had bought for her and looking remarkably composed for a 6-year-old about to testify in federal court. Across the aisle, Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford sat with their army of attorneys, 12 lawyers in total, representing the best legal talent money could buy. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Williams," the bailiff announced. Judge Williams was a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd presided over complex cases for decades. As she settled into her chair, her eyes briefly met Emma's, and Richard caught a flicker of curiosity in the judge's expression. "This is highly irregular," said James Morrison, the lead attorney for the defendants, rising to address the court. "Your Honor, the plaintiff is asking this court to believe that a 6-year-old child discovered sophisticated financial fraud that escaped the notice of multiple law firms and corporate auditors. We respectfully submit that this is either an elaborate hoax or evidence of coaching by adults with their own agenda." Sarah stood to respond. "Your Honor, we welcome Mr. Morrison's skepticism. In fact, we are prepared to demonstrate not only that Emma Hamilton Chen discovered this fraud independently, but that her unique analytical abilities allowed her to see patterns that conventional legal review missed entirely." Richard noticed that Sarah had given Emma a hyphenated name for the proceedings, a legal strategy to establish her as part of the plaintiff's family unit while protecting her identity. Emma had chosen Chen herself, saying she wanted to honor both Sarah and the grandmother who taught her to see truth in patterns. "Very well," Judge Williams said, "but I want to make something clear to all parties. This court will not tolerate any attempt to exploit or manipulate a child, regardless of which side makes such an attempt. Ms. Chen, you may begin your presentation." Sarah approached the evidence table with confidence. "Your Honor, we'll start with the most straightforward evidence, the predated filing documents that establish a clear timeline of fraud." She activated a large screen, showing the contracts side by side with their government filing dates. "As you can see, every major asset transfer was filed with the Secretary of State's office before Mr. Hamilton signed the corresponding contracts. This alone constitutes multiple felonies under federal fraud statutes." Morrison stood quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. These could easily be clerical errors or system glitches in the filing dates." "Sustained," Judge Williams said. "Ms. Chen, you'll need to establish intent to defraud, not just discrepancies in paperwork." Sarah smiled. "Of course, Your Honor. Emma, would you please explain to the court how you discovered the pattern of deception in these contracts?" Emma stood up, her small voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's sound system. "Your Honor, when I looked at these papers, I noticed that the grown-ups were playing a shell game with Mr. Richards' company." Judge Williams leaned forward slightly, her stern expression softening with interest. "Can you explain what you mean by a shell game, Emma?" "It's when someone moves things around really fast, so you can't tell where they went," Emma said, moving to stand near the evidence screen with remarkable poise. Mr. Richard thought he was becoming partners with these men, but really they were moving all the pieces of his company into boxes they controlled. Emma pointed to the organizational charts she'd created. "See, they made it look like Hamilton Stevens Holdings was owned by everybody together, but really, Stevens Martinez Crawford LLC owned 100% of Hamilton Stevens Holdings, which owned 100% of everything that used to belong to Mr. Richard. The courtroom was completely silent as Emma continued her explanation, her child's voice cutting through complex corporate structures with startling clarity. Even Morrison's team was leaning forward, clearly impressed despite themselves. But the really important part, Emma continued, is that they were so sure Mr. Richard would sign their papers that they filed them with the government before he actually signed them. That's not just a mistake, that's cheating on purpose. Judge Williams was taking notes, her expression growing more serious with each of Emma's observations. Emma, how can you be certain this wasn't just administrative error? Emma smiled, reaching into her folder for the hidden email evidence. Because they wrote emails to each other about how they were going to eliminate the Hamilton problem permanently. People don't write emails like that about clerical errors. The impact on the courtroom was immediate. Morrison was on his feet instantly. Objection! Those emails are taken completely out of context and overruled, Judge Williams said firmly. The witness may continue. Emma looked directly at the defendant's table, her young eyes meeting the stares of three men who had underestimated her completely. The pattern is really clear when you look at all the pieces together. They planned this for a long time. They hid the important parts in boring places where they thought nobody would look. And they made mistakes because they got greedy and careless. Richard felt pride swelling in his chest as he watched this extraordinary child dismantle a multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme with the simple clarity of someone who saw truth without the filters of adult prejudice and self-interest. The cross-examination was brutal. Morrison approached Emma with the predatory confidence of someone who'd spent decades destroying witnesses, but he'd clearly never faced an opponent quite like her. His strategy was obvious: to confuse, intimidate, or trip up a 6-year-old until she contradicted herself or broke down crying. Now, Emma, Morrison began with condescending sweetness, you're only 6 years old. Correct? You haven't studied business or law or accounting? That's right, Emma agreed cheerfully, but I can read and I can count and I can see patterns. Those are really the only things you need to understand when people are lying with numbers. Morrison's smile tightened. But surely you had help understanding these complex documents, adults who explained what they meant. Nope, Emma said simply. I figured it out myself, just like I figure out puzzles and math problems. Actually, it was easier than some of the logic puzzles I do for fun. Come now, Emma. These are sophisticated corporate structures that challenge even experienced attorneys. You expect this court to believe that a child... Mr. Morrison, Emma interrupted politely. Why do you keep saying I'm just a child like that's supposed to mean I'm not smart? Some kids are good at sports, some kids are good at music, and some kids are good at seeing patterns in numbers and contracts. It's not really that weird. Laughter rippled through the courtroom gallery, and Richard saw Judge Williams suppress a smile. Morrison was clearly flustered by Emma's refusal to be intimidated. Let's try a different approach, Morrison said, his tone hardening. Emma, do you know what perjury means? Sarah was on her feet instantly. Objection. Counsel is attempting to intimidate a minor witness. Sustained, Judge Williams said sharply. Mr. Morrison, you will treat this witness with appropriate respect, or I'll hold you in contempt. But Emma seemed unperturbed. It's okay, Miss Sarah. I know what perjury means. It's when you lie in court. But I'm not lying. I can prove everything I said. Morrison seized on this. Prove it? How can you prove your interpretation of these documents? Emma reached into her folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers covered with her distinctive handwriting and drawings. I wrote down everything I found, when I found it, and how I figured it out. Plus, I made charts showing all the connections between the companies. And I recorded myself explaining it 3 different times, so there's no question about what I understood and when I understood it. She handed the papers to the bailiff, who brought them to Judge Williams. As the judge reviewed Emma's documentation, her eyebrows rose higher and higher. Mr. Morrison, Judge Williams said after several minutes, Have you reviewed the witness's analytical documentation? Morrison looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, we've seen some handwritten notes, but these aren't just notes, Judge Williams interrupted, holding up Emma's charts. This is a comprehensive forensic analysis of corporate fraud, complete with timeline, evidence chain, and detailed explanations of methodology. I've seen less thorough work from professional consultants. Emma beamed at the compliment. Thank you, Your Honor. My grandma always said, if something was worth doing, it was worth doing really well. Morrison made one last desperate attempt. Your Honor, even if we accept that this child has unusual abilities, the fact remains that she has no legal standing to make accusations of fraud against... Actually, Emma said, raising her hand like she was in school. I'm not making accusations. I'm just showing what the numbers and dates and emails say. The fraud accusations come from Ms. Sarah and Mr. Richard. I just found the evidence that proves they're right. The distinction was brilliant, and Richard realized that Emma understood the legal implications of her role better than most adults would have. She wasn't claiming to be a legal expert. She was simply presenting facts and letting the adults draw the appropriate legal conclusions. Morrison sat down heavily, clearly realizing that his cross-examination had only made Emma more credible, not less. Judge Williams looked from Emma to the evidence to the defendant's table, where Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford were looking increasingly pale. Ms. Chen, the judge said, I think we've heard enough testimony for today. I'd like to review all the evidence in my chambers before we proceed further. She looked directly at the defendants. Gentlemen, I strongly suggest you use this recess to consider whether you wish to continue contesting these charges. As the court recessed, Richard watched Stevens approach his attorneys with the desperate urgency of someone whose carefully constructed world was crumbling. Emma, meanwhile, was calmly organizing her papers with the satisfaction of someone who just completed a challenging but enjoyable puzzle. How are you feeling? Richard asked her quietly. Emma looked up with a smile that seemed far too mature for her age. I feel good. We told the truth. And the truth makes sense. That's all you can really do, right? Richard realized that somewhere in the midst of this legal battle, Emma had taught him something fundamental about courage. It wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what was right, regardless of the consequences. The settlement negotiations took place in Judge Williams' chambers, with Emma sitting quietly beside Sarah while Richard tried to process what was happening. Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford had requested an emergency meeting after reviewing Emma's evidence more thoroughly, and their demeanor had shifted from arrogant confidence to barely concealed panic. Your Honor, Morrison began, his earlier bluster replaced by careful diplomacy, my clients are prepared to discuss a resolution that might benefit all parties involved. Judge Williams looked skeptical. Mr. Morrison, your clients are facing federal fraud charges that could result in decades in prison. What exactly are you proposing? Stevens leaned forward, his face haggard from 3 sleepless nights since Emma's testimony. We're prepared to return full ownership of Apex Industries to Mr. Hamilton, along with compensatory damages for the disruption to business operations. Richard felt his heart racing, but Sarah placed a steadying hand on his arm. What kind of compensatory damages are we discussing? She asked coolly. $200 million, Martinez said quietly, plus legal fees and a formal public apology. Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. Can I say something? Judge Williams nodded. Of course, Emma. Emma stood up, her small figure commanding attention in the room full of powerful adults. That's not enough, she said simply. Stevens looked incredulous. I'm sorry, what? $200 million isn't enough, Emma repeated, with the confidence of someone who'd done her homework. You stole a company worth $7.3 billion. You used it to make money for 3 weeks while Mr. Richard was homeless and hungry. You also hurt all the people who work for the company because they didn't know if they still had jobs. She pulled out her notebook. By now, everyone in the room recognized the significance of Emma's data and flipped to a specific page. According to the financial reports I found online, Apex Industries generated $47 million in revenue just in the 3 weeks you controlled it. Plus, you probably planned to break up the company and sell the pieces, which would have destroyed what Mr. Richard's father built. Crawford shifted uncomfortably. Those are very sophisticated calculations for someone your age. Emma shrugged. Math is math, but here's what I think is fair. You give back the company completely. You pay $500 million for the pain and suffering you caused, and you each have to spend some time in jail to learn that stealing is wrong. The room fell silent. Morrison looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Your Honor, surely you can't expect my clients to negotiate with a 6-year-old. Actually, Judge Williams said, with what might have been amusement, Emma's assessment seems quite reasonable given the scope of the fraud. She's also raised an important point about criminal consequences that can't be negotiated away. Sarah leaned forward. Your Honor, we'd be willing to recommend reduced sentences in exchange for full restitution, community service, and permanent bans from corporate leadership positions. Emma raised her hand again. Also, they have to promise never to hurt other people's businesses again. And they should have to teach classes about why stealing is wrong. Stevens looked desperately at his attorneys. This is insane. We're negotiating the terms of our surrender with a child. A child who outsmarted all of you, Judge Williams observed dryly. A child who discovered evidence that you believed was well hidden, who documented her findings more thoroughly than most professional investigators, and who's now proposing a resolution that's both legally sound and ethically appropriate. Richard found his voice for the first time in the meeting. Emma's right about everything, but I want to add one more condition. He looked directly at Stevens, Martinez, and Crawford. You're going to fund a scholarship program for gifted children who don't have access to proper education. Emma showed me that there are brilliant kids out there who just need someone to believe in them. Emma's eyes lit up. Really? We could help other kids who see patterns like I do. Exactly, Richard said. The Emma Hamilton Foundation for Exceptional Young Minds. $1 million a year for the next 20 years. Stevens looked at his partners, then at Morrison, who was clearly calculating the alternatives to accepting these terms. Federal prison sentences versus financial penalties and community service wasn't really a choice at all. We accept, Stevens said quietly. Judge Williams made notes on her legal pad. Very well. I'll expect formal agreements within 48 hours, including detailed plans for asset transfer, restitution payments, and community service arrangements. She looked at Emma with something approaching wonder. Young lady, you've just negotiated one of the most comprehensive corporate fraud settlements in federal court history. Emma smiled, but then her expression grew thoughtful. Your Honor, can I ask you something? Of course. What happens to me now? I mean, I don't really have anywhere to live, and I don't think I can go back to hiding in shelters and libraries. The question hung in the air, and Richard realized that in all the excitement of legal victory, they hadn't addressed the most important issue of all. What would happen to the remarkable child who had saved his life and company? Judge Williams looked from Emma to Richard to Sarah, her judicial mind clearly working through the complexities of the situation. That's an excellent question, Emma, and I think it's one that deserves very careful consideration. 6 months later, Richard stood in the renovated boardroom of Apex Industries, watching Emma explain her latest project to a group of amazed venture capitalists. The company was stronger than ever. The fraud settlement had provided resources for expansion, and Emma's insights had led to innovations that positioned Apex as a leader in sustainable construction technology. But the most important change wasn't in the business. It was in the family that had formed from the most unlikely circumstances. The adoption process had been complex, requiring testimony from social workers, psychologists, and education specialists, who all confirmed what Richard already knew. Emma was an extraordinary child who needed an extraordinary environment to thrive. Judge Williams had personally overseen the proceedings, ensuring that Emma's best interests were protected while allowing her to join the family she'd chosen. The solar panel integration system reduces construction costs by 37%, while improving energy efficiency by 52%, Emma was explaining to the investors, using a presentation she'd created herself. But the really exciting part is how we can scale this technology to help low-income families afford better housing. Sarah, now General Counsel for Apex Industries, and Emma's legal guardian along with Richard, watched from the back of the room with obvious pride. The adoption had created an unconventional family structure, Richard as father, Sarah as second mother, and Emma as the brilliant daughter who'd brought them all together. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the child psychologist who'd evaluated Emma during the adoption process, had explained to Richard that Emma's intelligence fell into a category that occurred perhaps once in a generation. She doesn't just have a high IQ, Dr. Martinez had said. She has a unique form of pattern recognition that allows her to see connections others miss entirely. Combined with emotional intelligence far beyond her years, she has the potential to change the world. The Emma Hamilton Foundation had already awarded scholarships to 43 gifted children from disadvantaged backgrounds, and Emma insisted on personally interviewing each candidate. "I want to make sure they really love learning," she told Richard. "Smart kids who don't get to use their brains become sad kids." As the presentation concluded and the investors filed out, all eager to fund Emma's next project, Richard reflected on how completely his life had changed. He'd built his father's company back stronger than ever, but more importantly, he'd learned that success meant nothing without family and purpose. Emma bounced over to him, still wearing the small business suit Sarah had bought her for important meetings. "How did I do, Dad?" The word Dad still made Richard's heart skip a beat every time she said it. "You were perfect, sweetheart. Your grandfather would have been so proud of you." Emma's expression grew thoughtful. "Do you think he would have liked me?" Richard knelt down to her level, taking her small hands in his. "Emma, my father built this company because he believed that hard work and intelligence could overcome any obstacle. He would have absolutely loved you, not just because you're brilliant, but because you use your gifts to help other people. Like when I helped you get your company back, like when you saved both of us," Richard corrected gently. "You gave me back my company, but more importantly, you gave me a family. You gave me purpose. You showed me that the most valuable things in life can't be measured in dollars." Emma hugged him tightly. "You saved me too, Dad. You believed that I could help with grown-up problems, and you made me part of your family, even though I was just a homeless kid." Sarah joined them, wrapping both Richard and Emma in a group hug. "You know what I think?" she said. "I think sometimes the best families aren't the ones you're born into, but the ones you choose. And sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones you plan for, but the ones that happen when you're just trying to do the right thing." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the boardroom, the city stretched out below them. Millions of people pursuing their dreams, building their lives, facing their challenges. But up here, 47 floors above the street, where a desperate billionaire had once met a brilliant homeless child, a new kind of family had been born from shared purpose, mutual rescue, and the simple recognition that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can change everything. Emma pulled back from the hug and looked seriously at both her parents. "You know what we should do next?" Richard and Sarah exchanged glances, both wondering what world-changing project their daughter would propose now. "What's that, sweetheart?" Richard asked. Emma grinned, her gap-toothed smile lighting up the entire room. "We should help more people solve their really big puzzles. There are lots of people out there who need someone to see the patterns they're missing." Richard realized she was absolutely right. Emma had taught him that sometimes the greatest success comes not from accumulating wealth or power, but from using whatever gifts you have to lift others up. And with Emma's extraordinary mind, Sarah's legal expertise, and his business experience, they could indeed help solve puzzles that others couldn't see. "The Hamilton Family Problem-Solving Service?" Sarah suggested with a laugh. "I like it," Emma said seriously, "but we should make sure we always help the people who really need it, not just the ones who can pay the most. Richard looked at his daughter, brilliant, compassionate and wise beyond her years, and knew that his father's legacy was in the best possible hands. The company would continue to grow, the foundation would help countless gifted children, and the Hamilton name would be associated not just with business success, but with the radical idea that everyone deserves a chance to use their gifts to make the world better. "Deal," Richard said, extending his hand for a three-way handshake. "Partners forever?" "Partners forever," Emma and Sarah agreed simultaneously. And as the sun set over Manhattan, casting golden light through the windows of the boardroom where this extraordinary story had begun, a homeless billionaire, a determined lawyer, and a 6-year-old genius looked toward a future filled with the infinite possibilities that come from combining brilliance with compassion, success with purpose, and love with the courage to see patterns that others miss.